So welcome to my AWS classes. So we'll be starting our first service. So in the previous class we have understood the AWS global infrastructure. So in that we have understood what is a region, what are AZs, and what is the difference between a service and a resource. So since we know about the AWS global infrastructure, let's move ahead with respect to the first service, which is known as IAM. So what is an IAM? IAM mainly corresponds to identity and access management. What is the need for IAM? So let's understand why IAM is needed. So IAM is mainly needed in order to onboard the users onto a specific account. Right? In an organization, we have one particular account that is created for a project, and assume there are 3 dev team members and 2 from testing team and 1 from DevOps. All of them are working on the same project, same application, which basically means they need to have access onto those particular AWS account. Now, in order to onboard them onto that particular account, so we will be leveraging a service in AWS which is known as IAM. Right? So it's quite simple. So you are going to your office, right? In order to enter your office, you need access card. If you don't have access card, you will not be able to enter the office. Similarly, in AWS, we need to onboard that particular user and assign necessary permissions to that particular user so that the users can access that particular account. Right? And even that access card have some restrictions, right? So within your office premises, you cannot go to any cabin as you wish. Definitely there are restrictions where you are supposed to go. Similarly, so when we create a user onto AWS account, right, we can restrict the permissions of those users with respect to service or a resource. Right? So this is a basic understanding of what is an IAM. Right? So IAM mainly provides users, roles, policies, and groups. Let's understand one by one. Right? So we'll be mainly learning on why IAM. So we already covered it. Next, what is an IAM user? Next, what is an IAM group? We'll also touch upon what is a policy. Then, what is a policy structure? How does a policy structure looks like? We'll go through a couple of use cases like how to write a custom policy. Then we will understand what is a IAM role. Then what is a use case of IAM roles. Right? So let's begin. First thing is, as we discussed, AWS IAM. Right? So what is an IAM? It basically tells who. Who means who needs to access the AWS resources or services. Right? Who means we'll be creating those users, or it might be the roles. We'll come to know what is the difference between a user and roles in the later part of our session. Next, what, which means whoever the users that we have created in this particular account, right, what level of permissions that we need to assign to them. Right? Can we go ahead and assign admin permissions to them, which means that admin permissions means what? He has access to all the services and the resources. Right? Now we can restrict the access of that particular users. Right? Assume there is a user called Arun. He wants to access only S3 service or a specific S3 bucket. We can add the policies or permissions to sets to that particular user or Arun so that we can restrict him to use only that particular service, which is nothing but an S3 bucket. Apart from that, he will not be having any access. So policies or the permissions mainly defines the restrictions on the users or a role. right, on the resources or the services that are present in the AWS, right? So let's move ahead. The first one is very simple. So how do you create an IAM user? So how do we create an IAM user? So it's quite simple. We can go to the IAM console over here, go to IAM. So here on the left pane you can see you have users, roles, policies, identity providers. We'll go through one by one. So first let's get into users, right? So I've already created a user called as Arun. So let's create one more user. So I am onboarding one particular user who is Chetan, right? His name is Chetan. Now we have an option, provide user access to AWS management console. What do you mean by that? So I'm onboarding a user called as Chetan into this particular account, right? He will be able to access this account, same account, with his own credentials. So how can he access this particular account? He can access this account either through console or through CLI, right? So if Chetan needs to access this account over the console, over the UI, then you need to allow this permission set. So once you allow, it asks for a couple of things like auto-generated password, right? AWS automatically generates the password for Chetan in order to log into the account, right? Next, user must create a new password at next sign, which means that when I share these credentials to Chetan, at the very first time when he is login, AWS forces him to change the password, right? So this thing, we'll click on next. Then next thing is permissions. As I mentioned earlier, what level of access does Chetan has? Like, we need to determine what is the level of access that we need to provide him. It purely depends on the project, right? You can add that particular user to a group, or you can copy the permissions from already existing user. So here you can see Arun has these permission sets. He has a S3 full access permission. If I click this, so now Chetan will also have the permission sets similar to that of Arun, right? If I don't want to do that, I can directly click assign policies with respect to it, right? So I can search like EC2 full access, or we can see this EC2 full access. If I provide this permission to Chetan, now Chetan will be able to access EC2, which means that he will be able to create, delete, modify the instance, which means that he will be having an admin permission on this complete service. No, I don't want to give Chetan admin level privileges. I just want to give the read-only privileges, right? You have this option. If I give EC2 read-only access to that particular user, then he will only be able to view those particular instance. He will not be able to do any write operations, which is nothing but he will not be able to terminate that particular instance, right? So in this way, now, so this is how we attach the policy. Next, so here we will review and we will create that particular user name is Chetan, auto generated password, require password reset, then the permission sets, then we have tags, right? We'll discuss on this tags in the later session of our course, right? So we'll go ahead and create the user. Now you can see the user has been created. This is the console URL for him in order to log in. This is the username and this is the password, right? We can download this particular file over here, which mainly consisting of the credentials. Now Chetan can copy this. If I share this credentials with respect to Chetan what he can do, he can copy this credentials, go to this particular account, wherein already the account name is populated, right? He can add this particular username and password and he can log into this particular account, right? So this is how we create a user, right? Quite simple. Now moving on with respect to groups. So what is a group, right? Group is nothing but collection of users, right? So if you don't have a group, I need to manually go and update the permission sets or policy on each and every user, right? Rather than that, what I could do, I could go ahead and create a group. So assume there is a development team members that are setting. I can create a group called as dev, right? Since I've already created 2 users, I can add these 2 users onto that particular group. And now I can assign the permissions onto that particular group, right? If I, in this way, right? Now I am assigning the permission sets onto the group, not onto specific user, right? So then I will click on create user group. Now an user group has been created and that user group has 2 users, which is known as Arun and Chetan. And what does this group has? It has a Amazon S3 full access, right? Which means that Amazon S3 full access is a policy that is attached to group, which is inherited by these 2 users. I need not to go and attach a policy onto Arun or Chetan now, right? So if I create a new user who needs a similar set of permission, I can just create this particular user in the user section and directly add him to this group, right? So this is all about users and groups, right? Now let's move on to policy. What is a policy? Policy means it's a permission set. What level of permissions that you need to give on for a user or a role, right? So there are around 1441 policies that are already defined in AWS, which is known as AWS managed policy. We'll come to the types of policies, but let's understand what is a policy first. As I mentioned, there are n number of services in AWS, right? If you want to assign permissions onto any of these services, then there are predefined policies that are already maintained by AWS, right? So if you add that particular policy, right, which are nothing but you are giving that particular or you are restricting that particular user to access that particular service or a resource, right? So as I mentioned earlier, so we have created 2 users now. So if I check the permission sets of this particular user, which is known as Arun, so Arun has 2 policies that has been attached. One is Amazon S3 full access and IAM user change password, right? At the very first time when he logs into his into this account, he would be forced to change the password. This is the policy. In order to change the password, it comes by default, right? So Arun has now access to S3, right? Is full access to S3 service, right? So does Arun has access to EC2 instances? No. Arun has only access to this service, which is known as S3, right? Understood? So this is all about policies. Now coming back to different types of policies, right? Let's move on to different types of policies. So what are the different types of policies we have, right? So basically we have identity based policies. In identity based policies, we have AWS managed policies and customer managed policy. Let's understand what is an identity based policy. So as the name specifies, identity. Identity means which mainly defines either the user, group or a role. If the policies are attached onto a user, group or a role, then that type of policy is considered as identity based policy. Understood? So in identity based policy, we have two types. One is AWS managed policy, the other one is customer managed policy. Right? What do you mean by AWS managed policy? As I mentioned you earlier, AWS by default creates and manages these policies. Right? If you come to this policy section, you can see all these are AWS managed policies. You can see the type as AWS managed, right? Which is mainly created and maintained by AWS. Can we go ahead and modify these policies? No, we don't have any access to modify these policies. Then you may say that, sir, I want to write a custom policy. I don't want to use this policy. There is no policies that is defined. I need to write a project specific policy. Yes, you can write your own policies by clicking on create policy. Right? Here you can write or you can create your own policies. These type of policies are called as customer managed policy. We'll see through like how to create a policy in the later section, but there's a difference between AWS managed policy and customer managed policy. AWS managed policies are created and managed or maintained by AWS, whereas customer managed policies means, so the users or the customers will be creating that particular policy and they will be managing that policy. Right? So now we have covered with identity based policies, AWS managed policies and customer managed policies. We'll move on to resource based policies. What do you mean by resource based policy? Right? So in the previous session, you have understood what is a service and a resource. Right? So what is a service? EC2 is a service. The instance that we create within an EC2 is called a resource. Right? So similarly, S3 is called as a service, and the bucket that we create inside that S3 service is called as a resource. Now since you have understood what is a resource now, then let's come back to the topic resource based policy. What are resource based policies? If the policies are attached onto a resource, right? Resource means if the policies are attached directly onto a particular S3 bucket, then those policies are considered as resource based policies. Right? Coming back to identity based policies. If the policies are attached to user, group or a role, then it is called as identity based. If the policy is attached to a resource, then it is called as resource based policies. Right? Quite simple. So you can directly go ahead and configure the policies onto a bucket. Right? If you go to S3 service, over here, let's create a random bucket, create bucket, and just give random name. Right? Let me try to create a bucket. So bucket name already exists. So let me change the name. So I have created a bucket, right? In a S3 service, I have created a resource. This is my resource, right? Which is nothing but a bucket. If I go inside this bucket, you have something called as permissions, right? Here, so you have a section where you can define the policy, where you can directly define the policy over here. Right? It's the same policy, right? Who needs to access this particular bucket, which is nothing but you're defining a policy directly onto a resource. Similarly, how you attach a policy onto a user, you can also attach a policy onto a resource. And these type of policies are called as resource based policies. Then what is an inline policy? Inline policy mainly corresponds to which is directly attached to a single entity, right? So suppose, so I'm attaching a policy onto a particular user, right? And that policy is defined in such a way that I cannot reuse that particular policy onto any other user. It is aligned to that specific user, right? If you come over here, if I go to IAM section, policies, so in here, whatever the policies that you are seeing, I can assign this policy to any of the users that I create, right? So if I want to showcase, so Amazon S3 full access, this policy can be attached on Arun, can be attached on Chetan, right? The same policy I can attach on Arun as well as Chetan. I can reuse these policies. But if you define a policy, right, an inline policy, if you create a policy called as inline policy, that specific policy is aligned to that specific user, group or a role. You cannot reuse that particular user. It is tagged to that particular entity, right? Those are called as inline policies. Now we have something called as service control policy, resource control policy. What do you mean by service control policy and resource control policy? These policies mainly come at organization level or at a landing zone architecture level. So when we cover that particular topic, landing zone architecture, we can discuss more on what is a service control policy and what is a resource control policy. Then the last one is session policy. What is a session policy? Session policy means if you want to give a temporary access to any specific user, right? I don't want to give him the permanent access. I want to just give him a temporary access to this particular account, right? So you can create those policies and assign those policies to that particular user so that he will be having a specified duration of time where he can get the access. Those type of policies are called as session based policy. Understood? So this is the overall view of what is a policy and why policies are required. In short, policies are nothing but the permission sets which mainly allow or deny the access to services or a resource. Clear? So let's move on. Let's move to the next topic, which is nothing but policy structure. So as you know, you can write your own policies, right, which are nothing but customer managed policies. If you want to write a customer managed policy, the very first thing is you need to understand the structure of a policy. Without understanding the basic structure of a policy, you will not be in a position to create a customer managed policy. So let's understand. So policies are generally written in JSON format, which mainly consisting of statement, right? So within this statement, we will be having SID. It's just a name or a label, which is an optional field. Next, you have something called as effect. Effect can take two values, right? And it is a mandatory field, either allow or deny. Then we have a principal section, which is an optional field. We can discuss this later. Then we have something called as action, so which is a mandatory field. Next, we have a section for resource and then condition. So in order to write a policy, right? So there are three main mandatory fields. One is effect, the next one is action, the other one is resource. So let's understand. So here in a sample policy, so here you can see in effect we have added allow. In the action, we have defined action called as S3 list bucket and S3 get object, which means that we are allowing only these two actions, which means that if I apply this policy or if I assign this policy to a particular user, he will be able to list the buckets. He will be able to get the particular objects that are stored in this bucket, right? Can he go ahead and rename this bucket? No. Can he go ahead and delete this bucket? No. Right? So this defines mainly the actions, right? Finally, resource. On which particular resource? You know what is a resource now, right? Within S3 service, we have created a bucket called as my demo bucket, which means that these actions are allowed on this particular bucket, right? But it says these action list bucket and get object actions are allowed, which is defined in the effect section, onto this particular resource, which is known as my demo bucket. So these are the mandatory fields which needs to be defined in a policy. Now, if you ask me a question, can we have multiple statements within the policy? Yes. You can define similar multiple statements within a policy, right? So this is a basic structure of a policy, right? So let's move on and understand a couple of other use cases. Now we already know the first policy, which is nothing but, so we are giving a name, allow S3 read only, effect allow, again the list bucket and get object on this particular bucket. You may ask why you have two ARNs which are specified over here. The first one is at the bucket level, the second one is at the object level, which means that if I add a star at the end of this bucket name, which means that this permission sets are allowed on all the objects that are stored in a bucket. Right, this is my first policy. Moving on to the second policy, let's discuss on this. So as I mentioned earlier, there is one more component called as principal. What do you mean by principal? Right, so principal mainly states, right, if you are adding a principal, it is not a mandatory field, right? So if you are adding the principal component over here, which mainly specifies, here you can see I have added the Amazon resource name. ARN mainly corresponds to Amazon resource name of the particular user called as Arun. So what does it signifies? It signifies that this particular action is allowed, right, onto this bucket for only to this user. Can I reuse this particular policy to Chetan? No, I cannot reuse this policy because this policy is mainly intended or aligned to this particular user, right? Principal mainly defines who is accessing that particular policy. Resource mainly defines on which particular resource these actions are allowed, right? So is it mandatory to add a principal component in the policy? No, it is not a mandatory field, right? Normally in an organization where we are creating a particular policy, we will exclude the principal component. Why? If you add a principal component into a policy, then that policy become restrictive. You cannot apply that policy onto any other specific user, group or a role, right? Next, the third policy showcases the use of condition. You can use the condition statement over here in order to restrict the policy to some specific source IP. If this particular source IP matches to this particular IP address, then allow these actions on this bucket. If the request is generating from this IP, only then allow this particular permission sets, right? So is condition mandatory? No. Condition is also not mandatory. Whenever it is needed based on the specific requirement, we can leverage conditions or principles. So this is a general overview of policy. Like how does a policy looks like? Understood? So policy mainly consisting of statement. Within statement there are three mandatory fields. The first one is action, second one is effect, third one is resource. You have additional parameters which is known as principle and conditions. Right? Understood? So let's move on. So this is all about policies. So before moving on to role, let's create a simple policy. Right? Let's create a customer managed policy. So all these are AWS managed policy. So if I want to create a policy, I'm selecting create policy. I need to first select a service, right? So I will go ahead and select this particular service, right? So this is a service which is nothing but the permissions that we are allowing onto this service. What actions? So this mainly corresponds to this, right? So if I come back to policy, so here you are seeing S3. S3 mainly corresponds to the service. This is what we are selecting over here, right? Here you can see S3 colon list buckets, S3 colon get objects, which is nothing but S3 is a service and these are the actions, right? While creating a policy, the first thing that what we did is we selected the service. Next, what actions? See here you can see in S3 service they have defined two actions. One is list bucket, the other one is get object. Similarly, EC2 has all these actions, right? You have, if I select this, it is nothing but full access to S3. Full access to EC2. No, I don't want to give full access. I don't want to allow all the actions. Then you have a capability of selecting the corresponding actions, right? So in list itself you have so many options. Similarly you have read, similarly you have write. So for use case I will just select all actions, right? Now which means that in the slide I have selected S3. Now I have selected the action. I am just still looking into the action part. Done, right? Moving on with next, I need to select. If I need to add more permissions, I can go ahead and add the more permissions. If I need to add any conditions, I can add the conditions. I'll not do that. I'm just moving ahead. I've selected all actions. Now here I need to select the resource, which mainly corresponds to this, right? On which resource you want to apply this actions, right? Which is nothing but I will select all, which is nothing but I am selecting all action on all the EC2 instances that are created in this account, right? Click on next. Now I can define a policy name, right? I can define EC2 custom policy. Give some description. This is the policy that we have. Service is EC2, access level is full access on all the resources. Similarly, you can have a tags, then click on create policy, right? So it will take some amount of time. So yes, the policy has been created. You can view the policy over here, or you can filter the policy from over here as well. So this is a policy which I have created. So if you can see here, you can see the JSON as well. So here we have statement. So it is done through Visual Editor. Effect is allow. Action EC2, it's a service. What actions? Star mainly corresponds to all the action. resource on all the EC2 instances, which is nothing but star, right? So this is how we create a custom policy or customer managed policy, right? Okay, now moving on to roles, right? Let's move on to the next topic, which is nothing but roles. What is a role? What is the need of role? So assume, right, an EC2 instance wants to access an S3 bucket, right? So you have written some code, right? You have written some code in a server. That particular code, what it is doing is it is going and accessing the S3 bucket. So here the point we need to understand is the user is not going and accessing the bucket. Instead, the EC2 service wants to access the S3 bucket, right? Normally in AWS, each service is independent of each other. What do you mean by this? Which means none of the services can communicate to each other without defining proper permission sets, right? Even the EC2 instance or that particular resource needs to have access to that particular service, which is nothing but S3. So how do you give the access to that particular instance? It is again with the help of permissions, which is nothing but policy. Now, can I go ahead and attach policy directly onto an EC2 instance? No. We have created, we can directly attach a policy onto a resource, which is nothing but resource based policy, which is where we have seen that we can directly attach a policy onto an S3 bucket. But in the case of EC2 instance, right, we cannot directly attach a policy onto an instance. Instead, that can be done with the help of a role, right? You can create a role, you can assign the necessary permission to that particular role, right? Whatever that EC2 instance wants to access, then assign that particular role to that instance. So in this way, that EC2 instance will be having access to S3 bucket, right? So this is just a case of EC2, right? Similarly, you have something called as Lambda, right? When we go into the Lambda service, you'll understand. Even the Lambda functions, the functions means it is a resource that is created under Lambda. Even the functions will not be having access to any of the resources. Similarly, you have something called as Elastic Container Service. Similarly, Elastic Kubernetes Service, right? So wherever you feel like, okay, this particular service wants to communicate to other service, then you need to create a role, assign the necessary permissions to it, and then assign that particular role to that particular resource. Clear? This is the first use case of role. Second use case of role is you can give a temporary access to a particular user, right? Assume there is a production account. In that production account, we have something called as, we have a S3 bucket, right? I don't want to give access to any of the user to access that particular bucket, right? Directly, right? I don't want, like, let's assume like we have a user called as Arun. Arun needs to have access onto the production S3 bucket, right? But I don't want to give access to Arun directly onto that bucket. Rather than what I would do, I would create a role and I will ask Arun to assume that role for a specified amount of time in order to access that particular bucket, which is nothing but Arun directly does not have access to that bucket. Arun is assuming a particular role in order to access the bucket that is located in a production environment. Right? This is the second use case of role. Right? Let's move on. So this slide mainly explains how do you attach a role to a particular instance. You go to AWS console, IAM roles, create a role. In role, you select a trusted entity, like who should be assuming that role, right? Define the permission, then create that particular role. Once the role is created, you can assign that role to the instance. You need to go to a EC2 instance that is already created, click on actions, update IAM role or modify IAM role, then select this particular role. Once the role has been assigned, you can log into that particular server. You can run AWS S3 ls command in order to list all the buckets that is present as part of that account. Right? So I can just showcase you like how to create a role. So let's come to role, create role. As I mentioned, you have AWS service, account, web identity, SAML federation, custom trust policy. We'll go with AWS service. So I want to assign an EC2 service, right, for accessing S3 bucket. So I have selected EC2. Now here we are defining the permissions. So I will be defining S3 full access permission, right? Click on next, and I am defining a role EC2 to S3 full access, right? So here you can see the policy, right? So in the action it says STS assume role, which is nothing but which is mainly used to assume this particular role. So EC2 will be using this particular action, right? Principal component, like who will be assuming that role? It is only the EC2 instance. Can I assign this role to any other services? No, it's not possible, right? Right? EC2 instance can assume this particular role, right, with this permission set, right? So let me go ahead and create a role. Now the role has been created. Once the role has been created, you need to go to service, EC2 service. I have not created any instance as of now over here, right? Click on instances. So once you have a server that has been spinned up, you should select that particular instance, go to actions, and then you will be having an option for attaching that particular role onto this instance, right? This is how we create a role and assign a role to a particular instance, right? So let's come back, moving on to the next slide. Similarly, as I mentioned, you can also set up a cross account role in order to access the S3 bucket, right? Similarly, create a role, attach a S3 permission. Like we have two accounts. This is happening between two accounts. Account B is our prod account, account A is our dev account. So what are we doing here? We are creating a role, right? So we are assigning the S3 permissions over here. Then we are updating the trust policy to this particular account, like who needs to assume this role. As I mentioned earlier, instead of EC2, we can mention the account name over here and then STS assume role, right? So then we come to the account A, we will attach a policy to that particular user called as Arun, where we will be specifying the ARN of that particular role. Now Arun has a access to this particular S3 bucket which is sitting on another account. He can directly go to the console, click on his profile, click on switch accounts, and then he can directly go ahead and access that particular bucket. Or through CLI, he can generate the credentials, right? Temporary credentials like access key, secret access key, and session token. He can use this credentials in order to log into the account by AWS configure, and then he can run the AWS CLI commands in order to access the bucket, right? So this is the second use case of role, right? So this mainly completes three main important topic in IAM, which is users, roles and policies, right? Next we have something called as identity providers. What do you mean by identity providers, right? So let's come back to the identity provider. So identity provider mainly allows user to sign in to this particular AWS account using their existing company login. So what do you mean by this, right? It's quite simple. So you are into an organization, you have an AWS account, right? So you already have an Microsoft Entra ID wherein which you have an entire user database is already maintained. You have somewhere around 200 plus employees which are already working in the organization and they have their own specific email IDs, right? You want to integrate that particular Active Directory onto AWS account so that the login becomes smoother, right? We need not to go ahead and create each and every user with the help of IAM. Rather than that, we can directly integrate that particular Active Directory, like the user database, in order to log into this particular AWS account with the help of identity provider. This is the first use case, right? Second use case is, so we all know that we have GitHub actions. Like assume in GitHub we can create the CI/CD workflow, right? So similar to your Jenkins. Now how do you allow a GitHub runner or a self-hosted runner in order to log into this particular account, right? So basically you need to log into this particular account in order to do some operations, correct? So how do you allow that particular runner to access this particular account? That can be also be done with the help of identity providers. So let's see through how we can achieve this. So use case 1. So as I mentioned earlier, so what is the first thing that you need to do is you need to create a SAML identity provider. As usual, go to IAM identity provider, add provider, select SAML, enter Entra ID SAML, just give a name, and you need to upload the federation metadata XML. So where do we get this? We'll let you know in the next step, right? We should be getting that through Microsoft Entra ID, right? So we'll be holding this. So next we create a IAM role, trusted entity SAML, then we'll choose a provider over here, click on next, define the necessary permissions. Like if someone is if some users are accessing this particular account with the help of this role, then what level of permissions they need to have. So these are the permission sets that I am defining. I am creating that role and I am verifying that trust relationship. So which is basically nothing but I am creating an identity provider. For that particular identity provider, I am assigning a role with a specified permission sets, right? Next, on the Microsoft Entra side, so I will go ahead and create an enterprise application over here. Then, right, I will configure the SAML sign-in. Then I will download the federation metadata XML. Then this is a file which has been downloaded from this Entra ID, needs to be uploaded onto your identity provider, right? Go back to AWS IAM identity provider and upload it, right? So once this is done, right, so Entra to AWS role mapping. In the same SAML section of the Entra side, we need to configure the role that we have created in the AWS. So by this basically maps the Entra login to the AWS user, So finally you will be able to test the login with the help of the enter ID connection. So in this way you need not to create the users onto IAM. Instead you are already linking the existing active directory or the enter ID in order to access this particular account with the help of roles and permission sets. Right? I know this looks a bit complicated. Just wanted to give you a high level understanding of what is the use case of identity provider. In the upcoming sessions, we will see through like how to integrate a Microsoft Enter ID onto AWS. Okay, moving on to the second use case, where a GitHub runners needs to access or needs to log into a particular account. Similarly, you have to go to IAM identity provider, click on OpenID Connect, then provide the token URL, select the audience, again it is an STS assume role, click add provider, then create a roles with the necessary permission sets, then create that particular role. So once you create a identity provider and the role, right, the next thing is you need to define the federated identity, like who will be assuming this particular role, right? So you need to provide the OIDC provider ARN over here, right, which is nothing but the identity provider that you have created, and also you need to define which particular branch and which particular repo will have the access to this particular account. You can define those things in trust relationship. Once these two configurations are done, so this is in where you can use this particular section in your GitHub action workflows in order to log into this particular account, right? So in here I just wanted to showcase you like what is the use case of identity provider, right? It is not that you need to jump in right away in order to create all these things, but rather than that, just understand what is the use of identity provider in IAM. Clear? So this basically covers the IAM, right? Similarly, you have something called as add MFA. What is MFA? MFA means multi-factor authentication, right? So if you are configuring the users, you can also configure MFA, wherein which after adding your username and credentials, there will be also an OTP that is generated on your mobile, right, where you need to enter that particular OTP in order to log into your account, right, which basically improves the security for this particular account, right? So this is all about IAM, which is known as identity and access management. So thanks for watching. If you like this video, please do subscribe, like and share.